Hi, my name's Thelina. Last night, my own parents sneered at me in front of a room full of strangers, called me a disgrace just because I showed up late and covered in grease. They had no idea I'd been on the side of the road, helping an old man fix his broken-down car. But when he walked into that dining hall and took my arm, the room fell silent. Before we dive in, tell me, what time are you listening to this? And where are you? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. Because what happened after that? It turned my family's entire world upside down, and they never saw it coming. The narrow, two-lane road curved through farmland, the late afternoon sun pouring gold over the fields. I gripped the steering wheel tighter than I needed to, my palms damp, my knuckles pale. My old Chevy, a car I'd spent years tinkering with in the garage, hummed steadily beneath me. I'd polished it last night, hoping maybe a good shine would make me feel less out of place when I pulled into my sister's in-laws' estate, but no polish could erase the words I still heard from that morning. "Don't make us regret inviting you." My mother's voice had been as sharp as the silver bracelet she always wore. The words clung to me now, colder than the breeze slipping through the cracked window. My father hadn't been any kinder. He hadn't even looked at me when he muttered, "Try not to look like you crawled straight out of the garage." He knew exactly how much that stung. My garage was the only place where I ever felt useful, fixing what others had given up on. But to him, it was proof that I didn't belong in polished dining rooms or among people with last names that carried weight. The phone buzzed on the seat beside me, and I startled. Glancing down, I saw Marcella's name glowing on the screen. Of course. I hesitated, then swiped to answer. Her voice was syrupy sweet but carried the bite I knew too well. "Thelina, please, don't screw this up. These people don't tolerate mistakes. Just smile, nod, and for once, don't embarrass us." The line went quiet before I could respond. I let the phone fall back to the seat, my chest tight. My sister had always known exactly how to make me feel like a guest in my own family. I drove in silence for several minutes, trying to steady my breath. The estate was still a good 15 minutes away, and the closer I got, the more the dread pressed down on me. Every visit with them felt like walking into enemy territory, polite smiles hiding sharp knives. That's when I saw it. A vintage Rolls-Royce sat crooked on the shoulder ahead, its hood propped open, steam curling into the fading sky. Beside it, an elderly man struggled with a wrench, his hands trembling. I slowed instinctively, my mind already at war with itself. If I stop, I'll be late. They'll seize on it, tear me apart in front of everyone. If I don't stop, I'll betray the one thing I know about myself. I don't walk past someone in need. My foot eased onto the brake before I could talk myself out of it. I pulled over, gravel crunching under my tires, and stepped out. The warm evening air smelled faintly of oil and cut grass. "Need a hand?" I asked gently. The man looked up, sweat streaking down his weathered face. "Bless you, dear. Thought I'd be here all night." I rolled up the sleeves of my blouse, ignoring the sting of my mother's warning echoing in my head, and bent over the engine. The heat radiated against my skin, but I focused, listening to the car's wheeze. It didn't take long before I found the culprit, a loose hose clamp. With a bit of work and a steady twist, I had it secured again. "Try it now," I said, stepping back. The engine roared to life, smooth as silk. The man's eyes lit up with gratitude. "You've got a gift, young lady." I smiled faintly and reached for the small linen handkerchief I always carried, my grandmother's. The edges were frayed from years of use, but I kept it close, a reminder of the only person who'd ever believed in me without condition. I wiped my hands, careful not to ruin it with the grease that had already smudged my blouse. The man pressed my arm, his voice warm. "You've saved me." I shook my head. "It's nothing." But as I slid back into my car, my watch glared the truth at me. I was late. My chest tightened, dread clawing up my throat. I whispered into the empty car. God help me. They'll never believe this. The Chevy rumbled forward again, carrying me closer to the estate that waited like a lion's den. Ahead, the sun dipped lower, painting the mansion's roofline on the horizon. As the mansion came into view, I slowed my Chevy and eased it up the long, winding driveway. The setting sun glared against rows of luxury vehicles already parked in neat lines, each one gleaming like it had just rolled off a showroom floor. My car looked like a sore thumb among them, restored with care, yes, but modest and unpretentious. I felt the weight of comparison before I even cut the engine. A tall man in a crisp suit stepped forward as I opened the door. His expression was polite, but distant, the kind of look that said he wished I'd parked somewhere else. "Good evening, ma'am," he said stiffly, glancing at the smudge on my blouse before his eyes darted back up. I offered a small smile, though my chest felt tight. "Evening." I clutched my grandmother's linen handkerchief in my pocket as if it could shield me. The fabric was soft against my fingers, a quiet reminder of dignity I wasn't sure I still had. I climbed the front steps, drawing a deep breath before lifting my hand to knock. I didn't even make contact. The door swung open, and there stood my mother. Her eyes traveled over me once, and her lips curled. "You really know how to disgrace the family, don't you?" Her voice carried, sharp as glass. Guests lingering in the entryway turned at once. Conversations died mid-sentence. I felt the sting of their stares before anyone said a word. My throat tightened. I wanted to explain, to tell her about the man on the roadside, about the loose hose clamp, about how I couldn't just leave him there, but the words tangled. My father's voice cut through the silence like a gavel. "We told you to make an effort. Instead, you show up looking like this." His eyes swept over my stained blouse, landing with disappointment. He shook his head as if I were a child who'd spilled juice on a white carpet. I swallowed hard. But Marcella was already gliding forward, her voice pitched just high enough for the crowd to catch. "She probably thinks grease is a fashion accessory." A chuckle rippled through the guests, quiet but unmistakable. Marcella's smile didn't reach her eyes. She tilted her head toward me as if she were concerned, but I knew that look. She was savoring every second. Heat rose to my cheeks, and I fought to keep my back straight as my mother ushered me forward. "Don't just stand there. Come in." The grand hallway opened into the dining room, and I wished the floor would swallow me whole. The table stretched nearly the length of the room, lined with crystal glasses and fine china. Every seat was filled with wealthy relatives and Marcella's in-laws. Their whispers rolled like a tide the moment I stepped in. "So that's the black sheep," someone murmured, not even trying to hide it. I kept my eyes forward, though my face burned. At the far end of the table, I noticed my chair, set apart, near the swinging kitchen door. A place for the help, not for family. My hand tightened around the linen handkerchief in my pocket until my knuckles ached. I wanted to turn and leave, to walk back out that door and never return. But I forced myself forward, each step heavier than the last. Sliding into the lonely chair, I felt the humiliation press down. The laughter, the whispers, Marcella's triumphant smirk, they all blurred together until it was hard to breathe. I pressed the handkerchief to my lap like armor, its familiar weight a small rebellion. A woman across the table leaned forward, her voice coated in false sweetness. "So, Talina, what have you been keeping busy with these days?" I opened my mouth, my voice trembling. "I've been—" "Probably fixing up that old car of hers," Marcella interrupted smoothly. She laughed lightly, and others joined in, the sound slicing through me. My lips pressed shut. I told myself I came for dignity, not for approval. I repeated it silently, over and over, but the words felt paper-thin as Marcella basked in the glow of their laughter. I tried to steady my breath, tried to remind myself I wasn't here for them. Still, my fingers trembled under the table, hidden by the cloth. And then it happened. A sound outside cut through the laughter like a thunderclap, the deep, unmistakable growl of an engine. Familiar, powerful. The conversation faltered. I froze, every muscle tight, my heart hammering. I knew that sound. That unmistakable roar of the engine sent a chill down my spine, because I knew exactly who had arrived. The guests in the grand dining room shifted in their seats, glancing toward the wide windows as headlights swept across the polished wood floors. My mother leaned closer to my father, her lips pursed so tight they nearly disappeared. "Who arrives this late?" she whispered sharply, though the irritation carried far enough for several nearby to hear. I sat, frozen, clutching the handkerchief in my lap. My pulse raced in my throat. I knew the sound. I had felt the vibrations when I was kneeling on the side of the road, grease staining my blouse while I worked on that old Rolls-Royce. The butler, who had barely acknowledged me earlier, suddenly straightened his shoulders as if a monarch was about to enter. With a quiet urgency, he moved toward the double doors and opened them with both hands. A hush fell over the room. And then he stepped in. The same elderly man whose trembling hands I had guided through tightening that hose clamp now stood framed by the golden light of the foyer chandelier. Except here, in this house, he wasn't just some stranded stranger. He was someone the entire room recognized. I saw the color drain from my father's face. Even my mother, always so composed, faltered, her smile twitching unnaturally as she started forward. "Mr. Mathis, what an unexpected honor!" But he didn't even glance at her. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on me. I felt the weight of dozens of stares swing in my direction. Marcella's fork clinked against her plate as she leaned toward one of her in-laws, muttering, "What is he doing here?" Her tone dripped with disbelief, but her face held that carefully practiced smile. My heart thundered as realization settled. He wasn't just a guest. He was Mathis Kellen, the patriarch of the very family my sister had married into. The man whose word, I now understood, carried more weight than any cutting remark my parents could throw. Without hesitation, Mathis walked straight toward me. He didn't stop for Eleanor's outstretched hand or Richard's fumbling attempt at small talk. Every step seemed to echo louder than the last in the suffocating silence. He reached my side and extended his arm. "This young lady," he said firmly, his voice carrying like a gavel striking wood, "saved me tonight. Without her, I wouldn't be here." Gasps rippled through the table. A few mouths hung open. Others darted glances at each other, trying to decide whether to be impressed or scandalized. My father cleared his throat, his voice suddenly small. We didn't know." Mathis turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing on him with a quiet authority that could melt stone. "Clearly, you didn't care to ask." I felt the air thicken as shame painted itself across my parents' faces. Marcella's smile faltered, her lips pressed tight like she was chewing back rage. Then Mathis looked down at my hands. His eyes softened as he noticed the grease smudges and the small, faded linen square I clutched. "Dignity," he said, his gaze sweeping the table as though to challenge every set of eyes. "Isn't in how clean your hands look. It's in what those hands do." The words struck harder than any insult ever could. The guests who had been whispering earlier fell quiet, their eyes darting from him to me. For the first time all evening, I didn't feel like a stain at the table. I felt like the center of it. Marcella shifted uncomfortably, her nails tapping against her glass. My mother looked ready to sink through the floor. Mathis turned to the butler without missing a beat. "Move her seat. She will sit beside me tonight." The butler nodded instantly, stepping forward to pull back a chair near the head of the table. My parents exchanged horrified glances, the kind of silent panic I had dreamed of seeing on their faces but never believed I would. I rose slowly, my legs shaky, my grandmother's handkerchief still pressed in my palm. As I walked toward the place Mathis had chosen for me, I felt the weight of every eye on me, some filled with fury, others with stunned respect. When I sat down beside Mathis, I felt the weight of every eye on me, some filled with fury, others with stunned respect. The grand dining hall, lit by chandeliers that seemed too bright, buzzed with whispers, too hushed to catch yet heavy enough to feel pressing against my skin. The clink of silverware felt like tiny hammers against my nerves. I tried to sit straight, pretending I belonged there, though my palms stayed damp. Across the table, Marcella leaned forward with that brittle smile of hers, the kind she wore when she wanted everyone to think she was sweet. "Don't think this changes anything," she murmured, her lips barely moving, her eyes sharpened like knives. "You'll regret crossing me." My stomach tightened, but I didn't look away. I simply folded the linen handkerchief in my lap and kept my face calm. I'd learned long ago that sometimes silence stung more than words. Then, without warning, a server appeared at my side carrying a tray of wine glasses. As he bent to set one near me, the glass tipped, spilling crimson liquid across the edge of my plate and onto the white linen cloth. A chorus of gasps swept the table. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry," the young man stammered, though his eyes flicked nervously toward my mother. Eleanor's subtle nod, so small most wouldn't notice, told me everything I needed to know. I could feel the heat of humiliation climb my neck, but before I could even reach for a napkin, Mathis calmly picked up his own and dabbed the edge of my plate with steady hands. "Accidents," he said, his voice measured, "reveal more than intentions." The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. A ripple of unease spread across the table. My father shifted uncomfortably. One of Marcella's in-laws coughed into his hand, pretending to busy himself with his cutlery. Eleanor's smile froze in place, but her knuckles whitened where she gripped her fork. Richard quickly raised his glass, seizing the moment to redirect attention. "A toast," he announced, his voice too loud, almost desperate. "To family loyalty and dignity, the cornerstones of what makes us strong." Polite laughter circled the table. I noticed the careful omission. No mention of me. His eyes flicked toward me just once, cold and deliberate, before he drained half his glass. The sting burned deeper than the wine spill ever could. They were erasing me right in front of everyone, pretending I wasn't there, even as I sat beside the most powerful man in the room. I squeezed the handkerchief beneath the table, the fabric soft from years of my grandmother's care. For the first time that evening, I realized this wasn't just about surviving one dinner. It was about my place in the story of this family, whether they wanted me written out or not. Dessert arrived, plates of delicate pastries and coffee poured steaming into porcelain cups. As conversation shifted to polite chatter, Marcella leaned close again, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "You're just a charity case," she hissed, her smile never wavering for the others. "Mathis will forget you tomorrow. But me? I'll make sure everyone remembers your shame." My throat tightened. For a moment, I wanted to lash out, to throw her cruelty back in her face. But I caught Mathis watching me from the corner of his eye, patient, as though waiting to see what I'd do. Before I could decide, he gently placed a hand on my arm, his touch steadying like an anchor. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice calm but commanding enough to draw every head at the table. "I want you to visit the West Wing garage with me." The words seemed simple, but the effect was seismic. My parents' faces went pale. Marcella's hand froze halfway to her mouth, her spoon clinking against her cup. Something in that garage mattered, something they didn't want me to see. I forced myself to meet his gaze, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear the rest of the room. "Yes, sir," I managed softly, my voice steady though my hands trembled beneath the tablecloth. And in that moment, I knew. Whatever was waiting in that garage would change everything. I didn't know it yet, but stepping into that garage would unlock secrets my family had tried desperately to bury. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the estate, stretching long shadows across the marble floors. Mathis had sent for me at dawn. My pulse quickened as I followed him down a quiet corridor of the West Wing, my footsteps muffled against the thick rugs. He didn't say much, only glanced back every so often to make sure I kept up. The garage doors loomed ahead, weathered and plain, almost unremarkable compared to the grandeur of the house. But when he pushed them open, the sight inside made me stop cold. Rows of vintage cars filled the space, each covered with thick canvas sheets. The air smelled faintly of oil and old leather, the kind of scent that clung to my childhood memories. I blinked, barely believing what I was seeing. "This," Mathis said, his voice echoing softly in the cavernous room, "is what your grandfather cherished most." He walked over to one of the larger shapes, gripping the edge of the cover, and with a deliberate pull revealed a gleaming 1930s Duesenberg. Its chrome details caught the light like jewelry. My breath caught in my throat. I reached out without thinking, brushing my fingers along the cool metal. I used to sit in cars like these with him," I whispered. Mathis nodded, as if he already knew. "He told me once you were the only one who listened, who cared about the craft rather than the cost." His words stirred a memory so vivid it nearly knocked me back. I saw myself as a little girl, perched on my grandfather's lap in his workshop, holding a tiny wrench he'd let me borrow. His voice was steady and warm as he'd told me, "One day you'll keep the engines alive because you care, because it's in your hands, not their wallets." Tears pricked my eyes, uninvited. My parents had always brushed those afternoons off as childish play. Richard would laugh, saying, "Leave the tools to the men, Thelina." Eleanor would sigh, muttering, "She'll never amount to more than grease under her nails." I swallowed hard, the sting of their dismissal colliding with the truth standing right in front of me. Mathis bent down to unlock a weathered trunk in the corner. He pulled out a sealed envelope, its edges yellowed with time. He handed it to me with a gravity that made my hands shake. "It was left for you," he said quietly. My heart hammered as I broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter. I recognized the slanted script instantly. It was my grandfather's. "My dearest Thelina," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I could not tell you myself. These cars, this collection, are more than machines. They are a testament to care, to patience, to honesty. And they belong with you. I trust no one else to carry forward what I built. Not Richard. Not Marcella, only you." The words blurred as my eyes filled. A wave of anger surged up, hot and bitter. How many years had they lied to me? How long had they buried this truth while mocking me for the very passion he had cherished? Mathis's voice pulled me back. "You have a choice, Thelina. Hide, as they expect you to, or stand, as your grandfather believed you would." My fingers tightened around the letter. I could almost hear my father's voice scoffing in my ear, telling me I was dreaming. I could see Marcella's smirk when she thought she had the upper hand. And I could feel my grandmother's handkerchief pressed against my palm in my pocket, grounding me in the here and now. Fear prickled sharp in my chest. If I accepted this legacy, I knew what would come. Endless battles, poisoned words, doors slammed shut in my face. Marcella and my parents would never forgive me. But if I turned away, I'd be complicit in my own erasure. Mathis stepped closer, his eyes steady. "This isn't about cars. It's about truth and dignity. You know what's right." The silence stretched between us, heavy with meaning. I opened my mouth to speak, when the sound of footsteps echoed sharply behind us. I turned, my breath caught in my throat, and there she was. Marcella stood in the doorway, a smile curving her lips, sharp enough to cut glass. Marcella's silhouette filled the doorway, her smile thin and dangerous, like a knife glinting in the light. My pulse thudded in my ears. She stepped inside the garage with a deliberate calm, her heels clicking against the polished concrete as if she owned the ground beneath her feet. Her eyes swept over the covered cars before settling on the Duesenberg gleaming behind me. "So," she said smoothly, circling it like a predator sizing up prey, "this is where the real inheritance was hiding. Tell me, little sister, did you really think you could keep this from me?" I clenched the envelope in my hand tighter, willing myself not to flinch. "I didn't even know this existed until this morning." Marcella tilted her head, her smile never reaching her eyes. "How convenient! Stumble across a treasure trove and suddenly you're the chosen one. Don't insult me." She pulled out her phone and with a flourish snapped a photo of my grease-stained hands. The sound of the shutter seemed louder than it should have been, echoing off the high ceiling. "You know," she said sweetly, "when people see this, they'll know you're not fit for the Prescott legacy. Who wants a family face smeared with engine oil?" The contempt in her tone hit like a slap, but I forced myself to keep steady. Mathis, standing a few feet away, didn't move. He simply watched, his expression unreadable, like he was measuring us both. Something caught my eye near the far wall, a small, locked cabinet tucked away behind a stack of folded tarps. My chest tightened. I turned slightly toward Mathis, silently asking permission. He gave the faintest nod. I crossed the garage and tugged at the cabinet door. The lock was old and gave way under my pull. Inside, a bundle of papers lay scattered. My fingers trembled as I pulled them out, unfolding the top sheet. The breath left my lungs. They were drafts of a will, my grandfather's handwriting clear as day. Some were torn, others half-finished, as if ripped from his desk before he could finalize them. My eyes scanned a line that froze my heart. "I leave stewardship of the collection to my granddaughter, Thelina, who I trust to care for them with honesty and respect." Before I could process the weight of it, Marcella lunged forward, reaching for the papers. "Give me those!" But Mathis stepped between us, his hand raised. "Enough," he said sharply. His voice carried the kind of authority that didn't need to be shouted. Marcella's nostrils flared, but she stepped back, her nails digging into her palm. My hands shook as I turned to the next paper. This time, the handwriting wasn't my grandfather's. It was Eleanor's. My mother's. The words felt like a dagger. "Keep this from her. She doesn't need to know." The page blurred as my throat tightened. "They erased me," I whispered, barely able to breathe. Even from his last words. The fury rose in me so hot and sharp it drowned out the fear that had clung to me for years. I looked at Marcella, my voice low but steady. "You knew, didn't you? All this time." She leaned in close enough for me to smell the sharp sweetness of her perfume. "Of course I knew. And I'll tell you this, walk away quietly, or I'll ruin you. You'll never show your face at another family dinner again." Her words dripped venom, but instead of cowering, I felt my spine straighten. For the first time, the anger inside me outweighed the fear. I folded the torn drafts carefully, my hands firm now, and met her gaze head-on. "Maybe it's time the truth ruined you instead." Her smile faltered, just slightly. Before either of us could say another word, the garage door creaked open. Footsteps echoed against the concrete floor. Richard and Eleanor stepped inside, their faces expectant, until they saw what I held in my hands. The blood drained from their faces. The look on their faces told me they hadn't expected me to have proof in my hands. Richard's jaw tightened, and Eleanor froze in the doorway as if someone had ripped the mask right off her face. Richard stepped forward first, his voice sharp, the authority he had always wielded echoing through the garage. "Hand them over, Thelina. Now." I didn't move. The folded drafts were steady in my grip, though my heart pounded so hard I thought everyone in the room might hear it. Eleanor stayed a step behind him, her lips pressed into a tight line. She wouldn't even meet my eyes. That said more than words ever could. "You think a few scraps of paper make you more than what you are?" Richard sneered. "You've always been nothing but a burden, a disgrace to this family." My throat burned, but I refused to let his words sink into me the way they always had. I straightened, clutching the papers closer to my chest. "Funny," I said quietly. Grandpa thought otherwise. The silence that followed was heavier than steel. Marcella broke it with a sharp laugh, though her voice trembled slightly. "Oh, come on, Talina. Do you really expect us to believe you didn't plan this? That you didn't stop to help Mathis because you knew exactly who he was?" She turned to Mathis, her smile brittle. "She's desperate. Always has been." I braced myself for the sting of agreement, for Mathis to nod and confirm what they were all waiting to hear, but instead he stepped forward, his eyes locked on Richard. "Enough," Mathis said firmly, his voice carrying the kind of power that made the room still. "I asked her for nothing. She stopped because she has character. Something sorely lacking in this room." Richard faltered, the confidence draining from his face. I caught the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, and for the first time in my life, I felt the scales tip in my favor. Eleanor finally looked at me, but it wasn't with regret. It was with panic. That stung more than her silence. I drew a deep breath, my fingers pressing against my grandmother's handkerchief in my pocket. The fabric felt like an anchor keeping me from floating away under the weight of all their eyes. For the first time, I felt a swell of strength inside my chest. Validation, not from the people who had dismissed me my whole life, but from someone whose opinion carried real weight. Richard tried again, his voice lower now, more cunning than loud. "You've always been manipulative, Talina. Don't think I don't see it. Mathis, you can't trust her. She'll bleed you dry if you let her." Marcella chimed in quickly, her eyes darting around the room. "She's right where she's always wanted to be. Center stage. Don't fall for her act." I didn't flinch this time. Instead, I looked straight at Mathis, refusing to defend myself against lies I'd heard my entire life. Mathis's face hardened, and when he spoke, his words landed like a gavel. "I've known men like Richard my whole life, loud enough to drown out the truth but never strong enough to face it. Tonight, that ends." The air shifted. For the first time, Richard didn't look untouchable. He looked cornered. Marcella leaned in, her whisper meant only for me. "If you think one old man's word will save you, you're delusional." But I caught the slight tremor in her voice. I met her gaze steadily. Maybe it's not just his word anymore. Mathis turned toward me then, his eyes clear, unwavering. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice steady but heavy with meaning, "we bring this to the family table. The truth will no longer hide in shadows." The words hit the room like thunder. Richard's face darkened, his lips pulling into a hard line. Eleanor glanced between him and Marcella, her mask of composure cracking at the edges. My stomach twisted with equal parts dread and determination. Tomorrow would either destroy me or free me forever. That night, I barely slept. Every tick of the clock felt like a drumbeat counting down to the battle ahead. By morning, the weight in my chest hadn't lifted. I dressed carefully, smoothing the creases out of a plain navy dress. It wasn't expensive, but it was mine, untainted by Marcella's hand-me-downs or Eleanor's sharp criticisms. The Prescott dining hall glittered under the glow of crystal chandeliers, but the beauty did nothing to soften the air. It was thick, expectant, like a storm gathering. Richard sat at the head of the table, his expression smooth as glass, his voice dripping with false civility as he welcomed the guests. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he said, pausing to let his words carry. "It's important in times like these to remember the value of loyalty and dignity." Every eye flicked toward me. I felt them weighing me, waiting for me to falter, to justify every whisper that I didn't belong here. I pressed my hand against the linen handkerchief in my pocket, steadying myself. The courses passed in tense silence, punctuated only by the polite clink of silverware. Marcella smirked whenever she caught my eye, as if savoring the anticipation of what was coming. Midway through the meal, Richard leaned back, his smile widening. A servant appeared at his side with a leather-bound folder. Richard opened it slowly, deliberately, drawing every gaze in the room. "It pains me," he began, his voice heavy with feigned sorrow, "to reveal this, but the truth cannot stay hidden any longer." He lifted a sheaf of papers, spreading them on the table. "Thelina has been deceiving us all. These documents prove she forged our father's note to steal what was never meant for her." Gasps circled the table. Eleanor clutched Marcella's hand dramatically, her eyes wide. "Oh, Richard," she whispered, her tone dripping with practiced grief. Marcella's lips curled into a satisfied smile. "I warned you," she murmured, just loud enough for me to hear. The blood drained from my face, but I kept my voice steady. "Those are lies." Richard cut me off with a sharp laugh. "Lies. You've always been good at those. But tonight, the charade ends." Murmurs rippled around the table. Some leaned closer, hungry for scandal. Others avoided my eyes entirely, not wanting to be caught on the wrong side. My throat tightened, and for a moment I thought I might break. Then Mathis moved. Slowly, deliberately, he reached beneath the table and pulled out his own case. He set it down with a quiet authority that silenced the whispers. "Interesting, Richard," he said evenly, "because I happen to have the notarized original, signed and sealed, untouched since the day it was written." The air snapped taut as he placed the document on the table. The wax seal glistened under the chandelier's light. Silence. Utter, suffocating silence. Richard's face drained of color, his mouth opening, but no words coming out. Eleanor's gaze dropped to the floor, her hands trembling now that there was no performance left to cling to. Marcella's brittle smile cracked at the edges, though she forced it back, hoping no one noticed. I finally exhaled, the breath leaving me steady and sure. Mathis's voice cut the stillness. "Character, not deceit, defines legacy. And tonight, we restore what was stolen." He turned toward me, his expression firm but kind. "The seat of honor is yours, Thelina." The room seemed to tilt as I rose to my feet. My heart pounded, but my steps were steady. I walked the length of the table, every pair of eyes following me, some burning with fury, others with respect they'd never shown me before. I sat beside Mathis, my back straight, my chin lifted. For the first time in my life, I wasn't shrinking to fit their expectations. I was standing in the place my grandfather had always meant for me. Across the table, Richard's jaw tightened, his glare sharp enough to slice through glass. He wasn't finished. I could feel it in the weight of his stare, the unspoken promise of one last battle. And deep down, I knew he was right. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the fight that would define everything. Richard's glare followed me like a shadow. I knew he wasn't finished. Not yet. The next morning, the estate was already buzzing before the sun had fully risen. Servants moved briskly through the halls, their whispers carrying the tension that seemed to cling to every corner. I'd barely slept, but I didn't feel weak. My body was heavy, yes, but inside there was a strange steadiness I hadn't known in years. When I walked into the great hall, the chandeliers sparkled as if mocking the unease that hung in the air. Every chair was filled, every face turned toward the head of the long table where Richard stood, his presence commanding, though the cracks in his confidence were starting to show. He cleared his throat and began, his voice booming like a preacher at the pulpit. "We cannot allow outsiders to tarnish what our family has built for generations," he declared, his gaze sweeping the room but landing squarely on me. "This legacy is not a plaything for those who stumble in uninvited. It belongs to those of us who have sacrificed, who have bled for it." For a heartbeat, I thought the room might erupt in applause. But nothing came. Not a nod. Not a murmur of agreement. The silence was sharper than any blade. Richard's jaw tightened. He raised his voice, desperate now. You all know me. You know what I've given to preserve this family's dignity. Are you going to sit there and let this pretender rewrite our history? Still, the silence. Eyes darted, but no one moved. Even Marcella shifted uncomfortably, though she forced a supportive smile in Richard's direction. Eleanor sat rigid, her fingers white as they clutched the edge of the table. She avoided my eyes. Then Mathis rose, slowly, with the kind of authority that required no shouting. His voice was calm, but each word fell like a gavel. The decision has been made, he said. Thelina is the rightful steward of this family's heritage. Your father trusted her, and unlike many here, she has proven worthy of that trust. He reached into his case and placed the letter, my grandfather's original note, sealed and pristine, in my hands. The weight of it nearly broke me, not because of the paper itself, but because of the years of dismissal, of being erased, of being told I didn't belong. This was proof I always had. Gasps rippled through the hall. Richard's face drained of color. Eleanor's lips pressed together so tightly they nearly disappeared. So be it, she whispered finally, her voice brittle. It wasn't acceptance. It was fear. Fear of losing what little standing she still had. Marcella burst into tears, her voice trembling as she muttered, "She tricked you all. You'll regret this." But no one turned to comfort her. No one believed her now. Richard slammed his palm against the table. "This is madness!" he roared, his mask slipping completely. When no one rose to support him, he shoved back his chair and stormed out, the heavy doors echoing as they slammed behind him. The sound reverberated through the hall like the final toll of a bell. I didn't gloat. I didn't shout. I simply turned to Mathis and said, my voice steady, "Thank you. I'll honor his vision. I'll make sure this legacy remains what he intended it to be." Mathis gave a single, firm nod. "I know you will." As the guests began to disperse, I reached into my bag. My fingers brushed against the linen handkerchief, worn, simple, but priceless to me. The same one I'd used that night by the roadside, the one that had carried me through every sneer and humiliation since. It reminded me that it wasn't wealth or titles that had brought me here. It was the choice to act with kindness, even when no one was watching. That was the soul of my grandfather's legacy. I walked outside into the crisp morning air. The estate behind me was still buzzing with whispers, with disbelief, with resentment, but I felt lighter than I had in years. They could hate me, they could resent me, but they could no longer erase me. I didn't just carry a name now, I carried proof that dignity couldn't be bought, stolen, or faked. The Prescott name might remain divided, but my place in it was no longer in question. I walked away from that hall not just as the girl they tried to erase, but as the woman who had finally claimed her own name,